Well, it's a pleasure now to invite Professor Colin Humphreys to speak. Professor Humphreys is Goldsmiths Professor of Materials Science here in the University of Cambridge. He has had a very distinguished scientific career and received numerous medals for his work, both national and international. He is also very interested in the relationship between science and religion, having been chairman of Christians in Science and having written extensively about this. In particular, his book, Miracles of Exodus, is much to be recommended and is, or certainly ought to be, out on the bookstall there. So do think about purchasing that. Colin.
Well, thank you, Rodney, for that very generous introduction, and it is a great pleasure to be here. So I will speak, I should say, to this very distinguished audience. So I wait with some trepidation, questions at the end. Popular definition of a miracle. Now, this is a really popular definition, so I know that many of you will not agree with this, but this is what, the person, the man and woman in the street is reading. This is a web-based encyclopedia called Wikipedia, and and it's very popular. And Wikipedia definition is: a miracle can be defined as a violation of natural law by a supernatural being. If we move on to Richard Dawkins, this is an article he wrote in 1999 called Snake Oil and Holy Water. And it's written Richard's got this wonderful style of writing. No, he seriously has. I much enjoy his style of writing, very easy to read, very good communicator. But this is what he says. He says, the resurrection, even the Old Testament miracles, are all freely used for religious propaganda, and they are very effective with an audience of unsophisticates and children. So there's the dig, right? They always get to dig in at believers. Every one of these miracles amounts to a violation of the normal running of the natural world. So he's saying much the same thing as Wikipedia, essentially. He's saying that every miracle, this is not only the resurrection, but the miracles in the Old Testament, all of these miracles amount to a violation of the normal running of the natural world. So that is his view of miracles. And I want to ask the question, is that view correct? And I want to consider just one miracle in this talk. And I should say I gave a talk on science and miracles at a previous course, which was a very different talk from this, because it contained, it talked about a number of miracles, including New Testament miracles. And I thought I'd give a different talk this time because there's some people who were in the audience before who are also in the audience today. So I'm giving a different talk. And just one miracle. Crossing the Red Sea. I think easily the best known miracle in the Old Testament, probably the second best known miracle in the Bible, the best known miracle being the resurrection. Where was the Red Sea is a key question. If you want to understand anything about crossing the Red Sea, we need to know where it was. And I'm going to be controversial, so you should be skeptical about what I say, because my views are rather different from most people's views. If we know where the Red Sea was, can we say how it was crossed? And does this crossing indeed amount to a violation of the normal running of the natural world? And why it's good to ask this question about this particular miracle is that the book of Exodus is explicit that the miracle had a natural cause. So the book of Exodus, you may remember, says that Moses stretched out his hand over the waters of the Red Sea, and the Lord sent a strong east wind to blow the waters back all night, right? So there's an explicit natural cause. Although the prime mover, as it were, is God, there's a natural agent. As I said, unfortunately, there'll be no time for other miracles, because this question, where was the Red Sea, is a very tricky question. And to solve that question, I think you need to have an input from science, as we will see. Well, this is a card which was bought in not a religious shop at all. It's bought in a normal card shop in London, and I've also been sent this card by 2 other people, and the caption is, "What do you mean it's a bit muddy?" And I show this because around the world, many people, millions of people around the world would recognize this card as Moses and the parting of the Red Sea. And Moses, of course, is not only the leading figure, I think, in the Old Testament, very well known to Jews and very well known to Muslims as well. So he's a Muslim prophet as well. So very well known figure. And this caption, you don't need to say who he is. I mean, just think how much money Ming Campbell would give for this instant recognition, you know? And just think how much money Tony Blair would give in 3,000 years' time to have this instant recognition. So it is quite remarkable that people in our secular society instantly, many of them will recognize this as Moses and the crossing of the Red Sea. The pharaoh at the time of the Exodus was probably Ramesses II. It is debated, but it's probably Ramesses II, the greatest pharaoh of them all. So this is the person that Moses was facing. Wonderful statue of Ramesses II at Luxor. Right, well now let's come to where was the Red Sea. When I was at school, I had a religious education teacher for 2 years whose name was was Major Evans. And the only thing I remember him saying, he said it repeatedly, was that the translation Red Sea was the biggest mistranslation in the world, and in particular, the biggest one in the Bible. And he stressed, as many people have stressed, it should be Sea of Reeds. And if you buy many modern Bibles, it will say Sea of Reeds instead of Red Sea. If you look at other modern Bibles, it will be a footnote. And I think if you buy now a King James Bible, I think it is a footnote there, that where the King James translates Red Sea, then there will be a footnote which says Sea of Reeds. So if we adopt that translation, then what the Israelites crossed, the body of water the Israelites crossed, would have been an inland Sea of Reeds. And as I said, this is the most well-known miracle in the Old Testament. Let's have a look at the geography. To help you with the geography, if you're American, that's the size of Martha's Vineyard. So instead of that scale, Martha's Vineyard, if you're British, that's the Isle of Wight. This is from a Phillips Atlas, and it's also the map which is reproduced in the New International Version Bible. So this is Egypt over here. This is the Sinai Peninsula. This is up here now, Jordan down to about there. Saudi Arabia down here. And you see this is Lebanon, this is Tyre, both of them very much in the news, very sadly at the moment. This is the Mediterranean Sea. And if you look at this map, what you see is that, and as I say, this is the map in the New International Bible, Sinai, Jebel Musa, ? There's another site for Mount Sinai up there. In fact, there's something like 15 sites have been proposed for Mount Sinai. And then if you look at the Exodus route, that says Exodus route in a solid line. Dotted line says alternative routes. And in fact, there are many alternative Exodus routes. So the route of the Exodus is really not very clear at all, not very sure. And so the body of water the Israelites crossed, was it one of these lakes? Could it have been the Gulf of Suez or the Gulf of Aqaba? And this is the Red Sea proper down there. Which body of water did the Israelites cross? And it really is not very certain. And there's no consensus amongst biblical scholars. But what there is a consensus is that virtually all modern scholars believe that the translation should be Sea of Reeds and not Red Sea. And their arguments for this are extremely strong. And the reason is this. The words translated Red Sea in our authorized version of the Bible is a translation of the Hebrew word Yam Suf. And Yam is Hebrew for sea. It can also mean lake or river. Suf is Hebrew for reeds. It can also mean marshes. So, for example, when we read that Moses was placed in a basket in the reeds, in Exodus chapter 2, the word that's translated reeds is the Hebrew word suf, and that's what it means. So Yam Suf literally means Sea of Reeds, and I think there is no argument about that. Where was the Sea of Reeds? Well, let's put in some science now. It is a scientific fact that reeds only grow in fresh water. There are some reeds which can grow in slightly salty water, but reeds cannot and do not grow in very salty water. So this means that reeds cannot and do not grow in the Red Sea, nor the Gulf of Suez, nor the Gulf of Aqaba, because these bodies of water are amongst the most salty in the world. And if you've ever had the pleasure of swimming in these bodies of water, as I have had, and if you wear glasses as I do, you come out and dry off in the sun, and you'll find there are salt crystals on your glasses. It is that salty afterwards. So we put in a bit of science. We say Yam Suf means Sea of Reeds. Reeds cannot grow in salty water. Therefore, Yam Suf has to be an inland reedy lake. Hence, it has to be Sea of Reeds. What are the candidates? Those are the 5 main lakes in the Sinai Peninsula. And let's look at them on the map. This is Lake Menzala. I should say this is where the Exodus almost certainly started from, a place called Cantir. The Phillips map in the New International Version actually has Tanis, and that's almost certainly a mistake. Let me deal with that very briefly. And it's an interesting story. Let me just spend a couple of minutes on that. The Old Testament says that the Exodus started from a place called Ramesses. And if you go back 100 years, Ramesses was unknown. And so many people 100 years ago thought this was a myth. They believed that, everyone knew of Ramesses the Great, Ramesses II, and so they believed that the Hebrew writers had chosen a place called Ramesses. They made it up. They're written many years later, and they said, okay, let's start off the Exodus of a place called Ramesses. Egyptologists did not know of a place called Ramesses 100 years ago. Then what happened was, at this place called Tanis, big slabs of stone were found which had on them, inscribed on them, Pi Ramesses, which means the house of Ramesses in Egypt, in Egyptian. So people thought Tanis was Ramesses, the place where Ramesses lived. So they said, we've discovered where Ramesses lived. This was the house of Ramesses, a place called Tanis. And then later on, at Cantir, this is modern Cantir, what was found there was nothing above ground, nothing visible. So it's been raised to the ground, but underneath the ground there were foundations which are absolutely huge, foundations of palaces, and the area of the site was greater than that of ancient Babylon and greater than that of ancient Nineveh. So just a huge site, thousands of pottery sherds, actually I think it's actually millions of pottery sherds inscribed with the name Ramesses, lots of stones inscribed with the name Ramesses, and Egyptologists now believe that these stones at Tanis have been taken from Cantir and reused. So the Egyptians did this all the time. They reused stones, they actually reused tombs as well. All Egyptologists now believe Cantir was ancient Ramesses. This is where Ramesses the Great set up his capital. And before that, the capital had been down in Memphis. So this was a new capital he established, essentially. And so that's where the Exodus started. And Egyptologists agreed on this, and they said, of course, this was a house of Ramesses. And so this biblical identification now becomes not myth, but some reality. So that's where the Exodus probably started. But then, depending on the route, they could have crossed this Lake Menzalis. They could have crossed Lake Bardawil, which also has a different name, which is Sirbonis. It's another name for Lake Bardaville. Here's a Lake Bala. There's Lake Timza. There's a Bitter Lake. So those are the lakes they could have crossed. Well, why did the Authorized Version of the Bible translate it Red Sea when the evidence for Sea of Reeds is so strong? And this is where the story becomes very interesting. If you go back to the oldest complete version of the Old Testament we have, this is the Septuagint, and this was a translation of the Hebrew Old Testament into Greek by Jewish scholars who lived in Egypt, and this was translated in the 3rd century BC. And let's just see where they lived. These are people who lived in Alexandria in Egypt. So this is where the scholars lived. They were not far away from these lakes, so you would imagine they had some idea where the Red Sea crossing occurred. What these Jewish scholars did, they were the people who rendered Yam Suf in Greek as Erythra Thalassa, which is Greek for Red Sea. They could have translated Yam Suf literally and put the Greek for Sea of Reeds. They deliberately chose not to do this, and they put the Greek for Red Sea. They must have had a reason for this. It must have been in their tradition. And we find this in the Septuagint quite a lot. In many places, it's not a literal translation of the Hebrew, but they translate it as they interpreted it. So this must have been the tradition of the crossing site. And this is the earliest known reference we have to where the crossing was believed to have occurred, not at a Sea of Reeds, but at the Red Sea. So we have to give some weight to this. We have to be very careful with tradition, but you have to give some weight to this and say, maybe Red Sea is correct. What about the New Testament? The crossing's mentioned twice in the book of Acts and in the book of Hebrews. On each occasion, the crossing is Erythra Thalassa, the Greek for Red Sea, and not the Greek for Sea of Reeds. So the New Testament translators, one way of looking at this is that they follow the Septuagint, But they didn't have to. I mean, this was in their tradition as well. And all the information we have suggests that if you go back to the 1st century AD, and let's say you met up with Peter or with Paul, or asked any Jewish rabbi, and you said to them, where was this crossing? Where was the crossing? Was it at the Red Sea or the Sea of Reeds? All the information we have is they would have said, without hesitating, it was at the Red Sea. So Jewish tradition going back to at least the 3rd century BC, Christian tradition from the 1st century AD, consistently interpreted Yam Suf as Red Sea and not Sea of Reeds, even though literally it means Sea of Reeds. It's only in the last 150 years or so that this translation, this literal translation of Sea of Reeds, has become popular. And in fact, almost all biblical scholars will now believe that. Well, can Yam Suf mean both Red Sea and Sea of Reeds? Quite a large number of biblical scholars believe this, and this is from the New Bible Dictionary, many of you will know. The article is actually written by Kenneth Kitchen, some of you will know. He's a great Egyptologist, one of the greatest living Egyptologists. And he says, in the Old Testament, the term Yam Suf, Sea of Reeds, is used to cover A, the Bitter Lakes region, I put ... because he goes on to say all the other lakes as well there, and B, the Gulfs of Suez and Aqaba, and possibly the Red Sea proper beyond these. So what he's saying is, Yam Suf is a catch-all term for any body of water, basically, in the Sinai Peninsula. And so he's saying it covers these lakes, but it also covers that Gulf and this Gulf, and possibly the whole Red Sea as well. And many scholars will believe that. Well, I think particularly as a scientist, but I also think, as a believer, or even a non-believer, reading this literature, that gives me a problem. And the first one is, people who lived in Old Testament times were not stupid. Let's generalize that. People who lived in the ancient world were not stupid. And they called places, they were descriptive names. If they called something a Sea of Reeds, it must have been, because in some way it was a Sea of Reeds. If we today go to the Lake District, we expect to find lakes there. Or if you go to Arizona and there's a place called Monument Valley, it's because the rocks stand up like great monuments. And people did this even more so in the ancient world. You only have to look at ancient Egyptian literature or Babylonian literature or the Bible, and you find the names were very descriptive. They made sense. So this doesn't appear to make sense. Why should the Gulf of Aqaba or Gulf of Suez be called the Sea of Reeds? And here's another example from Book of Exodus. The Israelites travelled by the desert road towards the Red Sea. That's Yam Suf. Now, to my mind, that statement implies they went by a particular road to a definite place. And if you had many bodies of water called the Red Sea, Yam Suf, to my mind, that doesn't make very much sense. So now let's ask the question, where does the Old Testament locate the Yam Suf? Is there references in the Old Testament where we can say, yes, Yam Suf has to be here? This is a very specific reference in the first book of Kings to where King Solomon built his ships. King Solomon also built ships at Ezion-Geber, which is near Elath in Edom, on the shore of the Red Sea, and that is Yam Suf in Hebrew. So you find this repeated in the Old Testament, that the writers are trying to pinpoint where certain events occurred. The problem we have today is that many of these places are not known. But Ezion-Geber, we know from other references, we know roughly where it is. This is again this map in the Phillips Atlas, but also in the new NIV Bible. And Ezion-Geber is marked here at the head of the Gulf of Aqaba. Now, in fact, we don't know, there should be a question mark actually there, we don't know the exact site of Ezion-Geber. There are 2 or 3 sites that people think it may be, but we know it is in that region. Similarly, Elath is probably either modern Eilat, which is in Israel in this region, or is more likely to be modern Aqaba, or ancient Aqaba, I should say, ancient Aqaba in Jordan up here. So we're not quite sure where it is, but we know it's in that region. But what we are sure about is where Edom is. And we're certain about where Edom is because of lots of literature referring to Edom, and that's where Edom is, right? So there's ancient land of Midian down there, that's Edom, and there's a land called Moab out there, but this is Edom. And so when Solomon built his ships in these places, in Edom on the shore of the Red Sea, there really is only one possibility. It has to be here. It cannot be over there, or it cannot be those lakes. And the other thing, of course, to remember is that Solomon was one of the wisest men we are told who existed. And if you're a wise person, you don't build ships in an inland lake because you can't get them out, right? So if Solomon's building his ships anywhere, it has to be either here or here. So you just sail them down the Red Sea. So that there's no doubt that that's where Solomon built his ships. And that's identified as Yam Suf. So this particular reference makes it clear that Yam Suf in this case has to be the Gulf of Aqaba. There are three other places in the Old Testament where you can be certain what is meant by Yam Suf. In every case, it is the Gulf of Aqaba. In all other cases, you can interpret Yam Suf in different ways because the geographical details aren't given. But in the four cases we have, in every case it is the Gulf of Aqaba. So we know that Yam Suf has to be the Gulf of Aqaba. It may be other places as well, but this is certainly some place it has to be. And it cannot be an inland lake in this case, as I say, because you wouldn't get the ships out. So the next question is, if Yam Suf, which literally means Sea of Reeds, is the Gulf of Aqaba, then are the reeds in the Gulf of Aqaba? Because, as we said, names had to make sense. So I've actually, one thing I've done is to do an experiment, and so I've been a true scientist, and one thing you find, which actually surprises me, I've read in the course of this work a number of biblical commentaries on the book of Exodus, and I've actually spoken to a number of people who've written these books. And one thing that surprises me is that a lot of people have never been. They've actually never been to the Middle East and seen the sites, which I find is quite... a scientist wouldn't do that. You wouldn't write something about doing... Anyway, so I've been to the Gulf of Aqaba, and I've travelled twice the length in a car, and I mean, this isn't very scientific. I just darted in and out at places, and there's absolutely no sign of reeds, as you would expect, and it's far too salty for that, and reeds are freshwater plants. If we go back to the time of Moses... go back 3,000 years ago, all the information we have is that the Gulf of Aqaba was still a saltwater sea. It would be remarkable it wasn't. All the information we have is still a saltwater sea. So there's a key question. Why is the Gulf of Aqaba called Yam Suf, Sea of Reeds, even though reeds cannot grow there? Here's another problem. Why is the Red Sea called the Red Sea? Because if you go to the Gulf of Aqaba, it is deep blue. And here again we have to say, ancient people were not stupid, and if they called something the Red Sea, in some way it must have looked like the Red Sea. The situation is even worse because if you go back to ancient times, not only was the Gulf of Aqaba and the Gulf of Suez and the main body of the Red Sea, not only were they called the Red Sea, in ancient times, the Persian Gulf and the Indian Ocean, they were both called the Red Sea as well. There is no record of Red Sea being used to describe an inland reedy lake, and that is as you might expect. This is one of the most scholarly commentaries on the book of Exodus. It's 3 volumes, and Hauptmann says, the origin of the name Red Sea is unknown. So a very eminent biblical scholar. This is an eminent Egyptologist, wrote a nice book called Israel in Egypt. There is still no convincing explanation for the origin of the Red Sea. So I was looking at these books, and this is a true story. It may not seem true, but it is a true story. I was looking at these books. I travelled there with my wife to the head of the Gulf of Aqaba to try and just be there and try and see if it was possible to sort these things out. And she was lying on a check deck on the beach, and I was up on the 6th floor in my hotel bedroom sort of reading these books. And I was about to go down, and I looked out of the hotel window, and there are these huge red patches, very vivid red patches, on the Gulf of Aqaba. And so the first thing I did was to think, maybe I looked at the sun first. So I looked at the white walls of the hotel room and see if there's red patches there because, something affected my eyes. But they were very white. And so I looked again, and there's huge red patches on the Red Sea. And I had a very cheap camera, sadly, so the picture hasn't come out at all well. But this is the frame of the the window in the hotel room. And this is the Gulf of Aqaba here. And I think these patches are actually quite vivid red, but you can see, I think, even this bad photograph, the coloration here on the Red Sea. Well, why are they there? So what I did, I went down to the beach very rapidly, and you stand on the beach, and you can see the red patches very, very clearly, and they're visible both close to shore and far away. But what's interesting is they're only visible at low tide, and the reason was I waded out to see what it was like, and the reason then is very obvious, and there's red coral just below the water surface. And at red tide, it really is just below. It's something like half an inch below, a centimetre below. And the whole effect is visible for about 30 minutes at low tide, and then you don't see it again. So what happens is, low tide, red coral just beneath the water surface, so the sunlight comes in, it penetrates to the water, gets reflected back by the coral, and so it appears red to the human eye, so it's visible then. And the tide has to be really very low to see this, because when I went in 1999, I saw this, and I went back in 2001 with a decent camera to photograph it, and I went back there, at low tide time, and it wasn't there, didn't see it. And then I thought to myself, how can this be? And in 2001, although it was low tide, it was at the time of the half moon, whereas in 1999 it was the time of the full moon, and as many of you will know, the tides are due to the effect mainly of the moon on the water, but also the effect of the sun on the water as well, so gravitational effects. And at full moon time, the moon and the sun collectively act together, and so the tides are particularly low then, and they're often called spring tides. They're both particularly low and particularly high as well. The high tide is particularly high. So the water covering then is very low, and the effect is then visible for only about 30 minutes, but then even at low tide, higher water covering, you can't see it. Now what's interesting is that coral is not only in the Red Sea, but coral is also there in its two gulfs, and the Persian Gulf and the Indian Ocean. So I think this explains why all these bodies of water were called Red Sea, because at certain times, when the tide is really low, the coral is almost exposed, and the sea appears red. All those seas will appear red. And here's another, again, not very good picture. It really, when you're there, the coloration really is very red. There's also another effect, which is that these mountains here, this is on the far side of the Gulf of Aqaba, are largely red sandstone and red granite. And these come down to close to the sea, and at certain times of day, the sunlight will shine onto these red mountains and reflect large red bands of colour onto the water. And this can be very marked at sunset. So not every sunset, but in the right conditions, so the whole Gulf then looks red. So I think the coral's the main explanation, but this may be another one. And this was visible most days, this effect, visible at most days, high or low tide, from a place I was staying at in Taba, near the head of the Gulf. So the point is that the Red Sea really does look red because of this effect. And I'm sure, this is the explanation, because people name things after real events they could observe. So let's try and summarize. 3rd century Septuagint renders Yam Suf as Red Sea, even though literally it means Sea of Reeds. It cannot mean a reedy lake, because there's not an obvious physical mechanism for a reedy lake appearing red, but we have found a physical mechanism for why the Red Sea looks red, and that could be the Gulf of Aqaba. It could also be the Gulf of Suez, because there's coral in the Gulf of Suez, and it could also be the main body of the Red Sea, because there's coral there, if this physical explanation is correct. The New Testament writers have the crossing site. They give the Greek for, which is Erythra thalassa, meaning Red Sea. So the New Testament says Red Sea. It doesn't say Sea of Reeds. And Erythra thalassa, you wouldn't use for inland reedy lake. You would say Sea of Reeds. Solomon built his ships at Yam Suf. Cannot mean inland reedy lake. So we now, I think, know why the Red Sea is called the Red Sea. At least I believe I suggest why the Red Sea is called the Red Sea. Why is the Gulf of Aqaba called by Solomon Yam Suf, which means Sea of Reeds, even though reeds cannot grow there? So I then went walking around, and visited there twice, and walked all around the head of the Gulf of Aqaba. And the first thing I noticed was that there's, in Aqaba, there's an ancient Roman site called Ayla, and it's about 200 yards to the north of the head of the Gulf of Aqaba. And at Ayla, there are great clumps of reeds, about 4 to 6 feet high, growing there. And what we know from Roman literature is that Ayla was a harbour in Roman times. So we can deduce, and this isn't my deduction, I mean other people deduce this, that in Roman times the Gulf of Aqaba, the waters of the Gulf of Aqaba, came higher up by about 200 yards, because now Ayla isn't on the shore than it was on the shore, so we know it came higher up. And there's a scientific reason for that. Is it right, we need to find well, we'll come to a scientific reason for that. Let's go back to I thought I'd put a map in. Never mind. Map's gone missing. Anyway, basically, this whole area is part of the Great Rift Valley. Well, it would be nice to find a map. That's good. No, there's a map. Okay. So the Great Rift Valley starts, I believe, up in Lebanon, and it comes down here, and it goes under the Dead Sea. It goes down this place called the Araba. It goes down the Gulf of Aqaba, it goes down the Red Sea, and then it curls around into Ethiopia. And if you heard the news this morning, there's been some extra activity on this Great Rift Valley, just where it ends in Ethiopia. And basically, you have one tectonic plate over here, and you have a different tectonic plate over there. And these tectonic plates are moving relative to each other, and they're pulling apart, and there's a plain here called the Araba and ridge of mountains on both sides. And so it's a very active region. And so the water level, because of all this activity, 2,000 years ago in Roman times, this was, we know, 200 yards higher up. And so 3,000 years in the time of Moses, it was probably higher up again. Right, let's go back to... So there would have been freshwater reeds, which are now 200 yards away, close to the water's edge, probably in the time of Moses. And it's interesting, these reeds have been not noticed by biblical scholars. And this is, again, a terrible photograph, but this is Ayla. So you see, these are the excavations. This is a wadi running down here, a dried-up riverbed. And here's one of these great clumps of reeds, which is, you know, it really is quite tall. It's almost my height. And then if you go between Israel and Jordan, and walk from Israel to Jordan, you get to some land which hasn't been reclaimed, and on this reclaimed land there are very large beds of reeds growing there, and these are different reeds. Actually, they're about 3 feet high, but all these reeds will be essentially freshwater reeds. And also the soil is thick clay soil, so it's really remarkable. You're in a sort of desert region, and you suddenly come across this thick clay soil. And this is a photograph again. This is the last hotel in Eilat, coming towards, we're walking here towards, you know, if you walk out of this board towards Jordan, this land is reclaimed on that side. I was surprised how much the reclamation was. It's about 6 feet of earth has been put up, a huge amount of reclamation. This is the last hotel, called Herod's Hotel, if you're interested. This is unreclaimed land, and here's all the reeds growing there. And they're growing on, okay, there's all the reeds growing there. And there's another place where there are reeds, and this is at a different place around the head of the Gulf of Aqaba. So this is the Gulf of Aqaba up there, and this is another place where these freshwater reeds are growing. So, key question, why are the freshwater reeds growing in 3 places near the saltwater Gulf of Aqaba? Because what you would expect is that the waters from the Gulf would sort of gradually seep under the sand, and it will still be salt water there. So if you dig in the sand on the seashore, for example, you normally would get salt water, not fresh water. The fact that reeds are growing means that you must have fresh water there, and this really is very unusual, as I'll show in a moment as well. It's really unusual to have fresh water right next to a saltwater sea. This is a famous geographer, Czech geographer called Musil, an explorer, and he talks about Ayla in 1910 when he visited there, and he says at low tide the rocky shore at Ayla was laid bare for a distance of about 200 meters, uncovering numerous springs which gushed forth with great strength. So here we have the shore of the Red Sea, because that's where Isla is, and the shore of the Red Sea has these freshwater springs coming up. Really unusual. And remember, this is a desert area, so really unusual. And he goes on to say that the camels, where everywhere else the camels drank from water taken from wells, he said at this place they refused to drink from the wells because this water was so good. They all went onto the shore and they lapped up the water from the shore. And the reason for this is the most unusual geography of the place. And what happens is that on either side of this Araba, which is this plain, there are high mountains, and the mountains act like a funnel, and all the water that falls on them, which isn't very much because it's a desert region, but the mountains are quite extensive. So a lot of water, if you integrate over the mountain area, a lot of water falls on. It then funnels down to the Araba, and although the Araba, when you walk on it, is sandy, underneath there is clay, and so the water doesn't sink down very fast. So the water sinks down, gets trapped by the clay, funnels down towards the head of the Gulf of Aqaba, and then the clay comes up to the surface, and the water comes up as springs. So this is okay. So this is what we've been seeing before. So the water collects on these mountains, funnels down the Araba, comes up here on the seashore as freshwater springs. And because of this fresh water all around the head of the Gulf of Aqaba, reeds can grow there. So it really is an unusual geographical situation. And this is a postcard of modern Eilat, and this just shows some of the situations. So this is the current head of the Gulf of Aqaba. That's one ridge of mountains over there, and another ridge of mountains is off screen here, but you can just see some smaller hills, as it were, in the foreground. And then this is the Araba running up here, this great plain. And this is the Great Rift Valley running down there. And the mountains were once together, and they split apart with the tectonic movement of two plates. And this is a picture of the clay soil at the head of the Gulf of Aqaba, where it's been unreclaimed. It's nearly all reclaimed, so you can't get to it. But this is where it's unreclaimed, and this is all thick clay. We were there in spring, very dry weather, but we had trainers on, and this is the footprints of our trainers in the thick clay. I mean, very, very thick clay, which is again highly unusual. But that's why the water gets brought up as springs. So what we can say is the Gulf of Aqaba now terminates with reeds around the top, just in a few selected places where the land hasn't been reclaimed. But you can imagine, if you go back 3,000 years, the Gulf of Aqaba could just have been terminated totally with reed beds around the top. And so I think this is the explanation for calling it the Sea of Reeds. It was just a rare juxtaposition. You have to realize that the Old Testament people, in any of these lands, water is of key importance, really important. And so they would have known which plants you associated with fresh water, right? Just as gardeners today will say, rhododendrons grow there, acid soil, right? So people there would say, reeds, fresh water, and they'd go and dig and get fresh water. And so they would know that reeds were freshwater plants. And I think they find it so unusual to have reeds around the head of the Gulf of Aqaba. I suggest that's why they called it Sea of Reeds. So my suggestion is the ancient Hebrews saw these reeds and called it Sea of Reeds. Greek-speaking travellers saw the red coloration and they called it Red Sea, and it's the same place. So when the Septuagint was translated into Greek, they called it Red Sea, and Sea of Reeds and Red Sea are the same place, and they both make sense physically. Now, it so happened, and this is another remarkable coincidence, in 2002 I visited a place, went to another holiday at Easter time, had a week's holiday in Sicily, visited a place called Syracuse in Sicily, and the guide told us that as we were looking out over the sea, he said, come and look at this. This is a very famous freshwater spring adjacent to the saltwater sea. And he said, the Greeks thought this so unusual, they invented a legend to explain how you could possibly have a freshwater lake by a saltwater sea. And the legend is the legend of Arethusa. Any Greek historians will know this. Arethusa was a very beautiful nymphette who was bathing in the river Elpheus near Olympia, and the river god pursued her. And she didn't like the river god, so she jumped into the sea and she swam to Syracuse. And when she got out of the sea, she said, I don't like this sea, it's a saltwater sea, I like swimming in fresh water. And so the Greek goddess turned her into this freshwater spring. So that's the legend which explained the situation. And then the guy went on to say, he said, he said the Greeks wanted to demonstrate to people just how unusual it was to have fresh water around saltwater sea. And so he said to show this, the Greeks approached the Pharaoh of Egypt and they got papyrus reeds from Egypt and they planted it there to demonstrate it was a freshwater spring. And this is the only place in Egypt where papyrus grows, and this was done. We're not quite sure when this happened, but it was certainly BC, and they're still there today. So this is, the sea is over there, this is this freshwater pond, and here's this huge clump of reeds which has survived over 2,000 years, essentially, we were told. But the story is very good because these reeds were chosen to illustrate it's freshwater, not saltwater. So places called Yam Suf. The Gulf of Aqaba, we have a physical reason, based on science, if you like, why it can be called a sea of reeds, because reeds are on the top. It is possible that the Gulf of Suez has reeds around the top. Hofmeyr suggested this in his book Israeli. He suggested that the Gulf of Suez extended further northwards, and then he suggested that the Bitter Lakes extended further south, and the Bitter Lakes are only slightly salty. That's why they're called bitter, but they're just slightly salty. And he suggested that they linked up, or that there's a marshy area in between. And if there's a marshy area in between, it's just slightly salty, reeds could have grown there. So it is possible 3,000 years ago, both gulfs could have terminated with reeds, hence both may have been called Yam Suf. So certainly both gulfs could have been called Red Sea because of the coral. But inland reedy lakes, I think, could never be called Red Sea. And in fact, there's no evidence I can find that they're actually called seas of reeds, right? I cannot find, there may be evidence, but I haven't found any evidence they ever called sea of reeds. So as I said before, there are 4 references in the Old Testament, each of which makes it clear Yam Suf is the Gulf of Aqaba. All the other references not clear what body of water is being referred to. Yam Suf certainly means Gulf of Aqaba from these references. It may mean the Gulf of Suez as well in other cases, and by implication it also may mean the main body of the Red Sea because they're all joined together. But I think there's no support for Yam Suf meaning an inland reedy lake. And so, you know, almost all biblical scholars today think this is the case. So this is going against what other people believe. But on the other hand, they have no explanation of why things are called Red Sea, and no explanation really for Sea of Reeds. So I'm suggesting that the body of water the Israelites crossed was Yam Suf in the Hebrew Old Testament, Erutha Thalassa in the Septuagint and the New Testament, and they're the same place. They both refer to the Gulf of Aqaba. They may well also refer to the Gulf of Suez and the main body of the Red Sea, but neither would refer to an inland reedy lake. Okay, sorry, we must hurry up. Now coming to the crossing, but it's really important. If you don't know the body of water crossed, you cannot really comment in any detail about the crossing. So that's why we spent some time on that. As far as I'm aware, there hasn't been any convincing scientific explanation as to how a mechanism, all right? So we're all agreed God was the mastermind. But if God worked in with and through nature, which is what the Old Testament says, that it was a strong east wind, how did this happen? The event was a miracle because the timing was quite remarkable. If you read the Exodus story, the Israelites were within minutes of being crushed by Pharaoh's army. In fact, the story is interesting because it actually says Pharaoh's army was in front of them and behind them. They were trapped. It says Pharaoh's army overtook them, which again is hard to understand because you think if the army overtook them, why didn't it capture them? But there is an explanation for that now that we know, I suggest, where the crossing was. So this is the head of the Gulf of Aqaba, and this is where I'm placing the Red Sea crossing. And of course, it is very controversial, so you should be skeptical about this. What I'm suggesting is that the Israelites went from Ramesses, where the Exodus started, and they walked along a trade route very rapidly, and there is an existing trade route here down to the head of the Gulf of Aqaba. Now, this is a high-up plateau. It's called the Plateau of LT, and it's really, I forget the height now, but it's a high-up plateau, and you descend down to the shore at this place, and the descent is a gradient of 1 in 3. So people can get down it, and people did get down it because it was a trade route. The trade route actually came down there, and the trade route continued down here. So this is where spices and myrrh and so on came from from Arabia, and also gold, and went into Egypt. So people could go down 1 in 3. Donkeys could go down 1 in 3. They're quite good at that. But chariots couldn't. And we know from Egyptian records that what the chariots did, they had a bypass, right? They had an alternative route. And the chariots came down to this place called El Thamed, and then they went in this direction up here, following this dotted line, and then they came down the Araba. So that was a chariot route, because they couldn't get down this 1 in 3 gradient. And I think this, I know a lot of this is speculative, but I think this explains how the Egyptian army who were pursuing them, I suggest the foot soldiers in the Egyptian army pursued them went this route, and so they were behind them, but the chariots had to go this route, and then the chariots were in front of them. And, you know, the chariots in a real sense overtook them. But if you just read the story without thinking about the geography, then it doesn't make much sense for an army to overtake someone else without capturing on the way. So I think this explains how there were Egyptians in front of them, behind them. They couldn't go backwards because Egyptians were behind them. They couldn't go ahead because the chariots were in front of them. Their only option was to cross the Red Sea. And the timing was the miracle, that God so arranged things, and that's another interesting question, that the Red Sea was forced back by this wind at the right time. The Bible also mentions where the crossing site was, and this was a place called Etham, and if you look in any biblical commentary, it will say site unknown. So I scoured through old maps, and this is a book, an old map from a famous historian called Sir Richard Burton, who wrote a book called The Land of Midian, and this is his map of the Gulf of Aqaba. And if you look right at the top there, which I've magnified, there's a place called El Itam Peak, and underneath in brackets the word Etham. And the ancient languages, both Hebrew and Arabic, I believe Arabic, but certainly Hebrew, were consonantal languages to start with. They didn't have vowels. And so the consonants you'd write down, you know, were essentially TM. And then the pronunciation could be Etam or Itham. And there's a Wadi El Itham. And so I suggest this whole region was called Etham, which is the biblical Etham. Right, well, what was the mechanism? There's quite a well-known scholar, German scholar Hans Gerdecker, and then this was popularized by a popular writer, Ian Wilson, who said the Red Sea crossing could have been caused by a tsunami, because in a tsunami, as we've seen, I get this wrong in my book actually, in a tsunami, as we've seen, what first happens, it doesn't always happen, what first can happen is the water goes out, right, and then it comes in again. And this happened in the dreadful tsunami which occurred in the new year, a year ago, and then in the recent tsunami in the island of, gosh, what was it? Anyway, the recent tsunami, the water was observed going out first. So the explanation here is that a tsunami caused by the eruption of a big volcano called Santorini could have caused this. Well, the facts of a tsunami don't fit very well, because when the water retreats, it goes out for about 10 minutes before it comes back. And so if you're saying all the Israelites could have crossed in 10 minutes, it is unlikely. The other thing, though, is that the dates don't fit. The date of the eruption of Santorini is debated, but scholars will agree that the earliest likely date is about 1650, and the latest date is about 1500 BC. So in that sort of time period, Santorini erupted. Most people believe the Exodus was in that time period. The earliest date anyone suggests for the Exodus is about 1440 BC. And so whichever date you take, Exodus was after the eruption of Santorini, and so the dates just don't fit. And also, when the Bible says a strong east wind, then that is not really the same as tsunami. So what I looked into was this strong east wind idea, and if you take this glass of water, and I won't do it here, but if you fill it up to the brim and you blow across the top, then you blow water out the other side, right? That's obvious, isn't it? That happens, but I mean, it does happen if you do the experiment. So what is happening there if it's just full of water? When you blow across the top, your breath is exerting a force on the water. There's a force per unit area, so there's also a surface stress, and the water is literally pushed back by this surface stress. And if you have a long body of water and a wind is travelling along this long body of water, the body of water is slowly forced backwards, and this is well known to meteorologists. And one of the most remarkable examples of this is one of the Great Lakes, Lake Erie, where in a very strong wind, the water height difference between Toledo, Ohio at one end and Buffalo, New York at the other end has been as much as 16 feet, right? So the water is just forced back. It takes time. If you're mathematicians, then it's actually the equations you have to solve are second-order partial differential equations, which I didn't solve because other people have solved these. It's all out there in the literature, and the water is forced back and back and back and back until you reach a steady state, and then the water goes back no more. And to reach the steady state typically takes 4 or 5 hours. And so it's quite interesting where the Old Testament says a strong east wind blew all night. There's this nice interesting detail. This wind just didn't, blow in an instant and the water went back. It was a prolonged event that the water was forced back all night. And that's what you need for this wind. And the event is known as wind set down. So when the wind comes and the water is pushed offshore, it's called wind set down. If the wind goes the other way, it's called wind set up. So not very imaginatively, but that's what they're called. So if you have water on a sloping shoreline, then water can be pushed back hundreds of yards. And this is well documented around the world. Shipwrecks have been exposed when this has happened. But for a substantial effect, you need a long stretch of water because you have to have the wind operating over a long stretch of water to force it back. And the wind has to blow for a number of hours. And as I said, this is all that night, the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind and turned it into dry land. So it's a very nice layman's description of the wind set-down mechanism. If you do the calculations, you get a negligible effect on inland lakes. They're just not long enough. You need a long body of water. The effect would work well on either the Gulf of Suez or the Gulf of Akka. They're both long bodies of water, and the effect would work very well. So if this is the real mechanism, in the Sinai Peninsula, there are just 2 candidates, and those are the 2. The Bible talks of strong east wind. Now, in the Old Testament, in Old Testament times throughout the world, they knew of 4 primary directions, north, south, east, and west. They were known throughout the world. They didn't have our sophistication of, northeast, northwest. So an east wind was anything from northeast to southeast. It just covered this sort of angular range. And if you look at a map of these regions, then an east wind would blow across the Gulf of Suez and it wouldn't push it back. But if you have an east wind is the wind from the east, and I checked it meant that in Old Testament times as well. So if you have a northeast wind coming down like this, and in fact the Gulf turns round a little at the top, then it would actually force the waters back, and there are mountains on each side, which once the wind had come in at the top, would then channel the wind down. So the fact that the Bible says an east wind means a wind with an easterly component. Wind set down would be caused on the Gulf of Aqaba, but not on the Gulf of Suez. And so if this mechanism is correct, and if the Bible is correct, then there's only one candidate, the Gulf of Aqaba. And so that's my suggestion, that that's where the event occurred. Now, I did some calculations. Other people have done the basic mathematics, so I just fed numbers in. And I put in a very strong wind, and if you put that wind in with the known sloping shoreline at the head of the Gulf of Aqaba, then the sea is pushed back 800 yards in a steady state. In a storm, there are usually large changes of atmospheric pressure, which could have doubled this to a mile. And you don't need that distance. This is a sort of maximum effect. You can, I think, just a few hundred yards exposed would be fine. So you don't need a wind as strong as that to do it. And also, changes in atmospheric pressure are very, very effective. This is an interesting detail. The surging waters stood firm like a wall. If you do the calculations of this in a steady state, when the water's pushed back, it actually does rise up vertically from the shoreline. And so it really is a very nice sort of eyewitness description. So this is a schematic of the calculation. So basically, this is a sloping shoreline. That dotted line is the original water level before the wind started to blow. Then the wind blows, and the water's gradually forced back. But you see here, that's actually, do the sums, that's 90 degrees. It rises up and then turns over. So, you know, in layman's language, walking across here, saying it's a wall of water is really a good description. This is slightly problematic, a wall of water on both sides. This is sort of possible if there's a ridge of higher land running across the top of the Gulf, because this is what you would then get if there's a ridge of land. So you have water there and water that side. The translation of the Hebrew here is not fantastically clear when it says a wall of water on both sides. Wall is in the singular, and so what isn't clear is whether wall is meant to be on one side. What is clear is that it means water on both sides. What isn't clear in the Hebrew is whether the wall is on both sides, if you see what I mean. And that's what I'm told by scholars. So, but there is water on both, needed on both sides, and for that you do need a ridge of land. What is interesting is, this is this postcard of Eilat again, modern Eilat. So this is the head of the Gulf of Aqaba. In ancient times, this would have been higher up, maybe to this sort of position. And when I looked at this, if you can see here, these are two salt pans now. So that's a salt pan, that's water in there and water in there. And I spoke to an archaeologist, and I said, you know, what was the idea when you were reclaiming all this land to have two salt pans there? And he said, there are these big natural ridges. And he said, this is really quite deep. And he said, we just didn't bother to fill it in, right? So he said, we left it as salt pans. So there's a ridge here, and there's another ridge there. So there are natural ridges here. And so what I'm saying is very speculative, but, you know, there is some supporting evidence, as it were, for it. What about drowning Pharaoh's army? Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and at daybreak the sea went back to its place. The water flowed back and covered the chariots and horsemen, the entire army of Pharaoh that had followed the Israelites into the sea. So the obvious question when you read that is, if the waters flow back, why didn't the Egyptians escape? Why didn't they get off their horses and chariots and just run away? And the implication is there wasn't time. Right? The implication is that when the water came back, it came back very rapidly. And the biblical picture is that of this rapidly returning high wave. So the biblical picture is that the wind blew all night, so it forced the water back very slowly, but then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the biblical picture is the sea just came back. And if the strong wind suddenly stops, what happens is all this water, which has been forced back, rushes forward because the wind has stopped, and it returns as a bore wave. And those calculations have also been done, interestingly. So the theory is there, and I just had to put some numbers in. The biggest bore in the world is in China. It's called the Hangfu Chi. I mean, you may think it's certain lecturers, but there's also biggest bore in the world is in China. And that's 25 feet high. And it sounds just horrendous in a way. It travels at 15 miles an hour and emits a roar that can be heard 14 miles away, right? So this body of water is coming in, it emits this huge roar 14 miles away. And the Severn bore has a height of up to 9 feet. Now, I just did some sums for the Gulf of Aqaba, and what I found is, putting the numbers in, the bore wave would travel at about 16 feet a second, and it would certainly, that is sufficient to knock a horse, a rider off its horse, or if you're in a modern bicycle, it will certainly knock you off your bicycle. So what we have a mechanism, wind sit down, followed by a bore wave, which I think fits very well the description in the book of Exodus. And the whole model, if it's right, certainly will need fine-tuning, because it's a very crude sort of model, but I think it does fit the biblical description really very well. And so here are, again, these muddy footprints, and we read about the chariot wheels becoming bogged down, and certainly in that region, if you drove a chariot across here, it certainly would become bogged down. So what I suggest is, let me finish now, if you look at the whole Exodus story, then there may be natural mechanisms for all of these miracles. And I think if you look throughout the Bible, there may be natural mechanisms for many miracles. I was just the other morning when I was reading about the resurrection, I had never noticed this before, with the stone being rolled back from the tomb. And one gospel says, an angel was there, and another gospel says there was an earthquake and an angel was by. And so, the gospel is actually saying, okay, there's an angel there, but there was an earthquake. And the implication is the earthquake moved the stone. So God was working in, with, and through natural events. So I think this is probably this I think is the last slide. So what I'm suggesting is that God's normal way of performing miracles is to work in, with, and through nature. You know they're miracles because of the remarkable timing. Not all miracles are like this. I think it's hard to explain the resurrection like this. Just let me mention in 2 minutes. Jesus and Peter walking on water, I think, then what I think is at play are additional forces. You've got walking on water. It seems to me that it's very hard to say that that's a natural mechanism because it's very hard to say. There was something published recently which suggested that the Sea of Galilee was frozen over, but I think it's a bit far-fetched. So it seems to me you've got there's two possible explanations, if you like, of walking on water. One is that gravity was locally suspended, right, and so you walk on water. The other is that gravity just operated as normal, and that God was providing additional force and uplifting the people as they walked across. And so I think if you're a scientist, the idea of locally suspending gravity, is something you don't want to go into because you have these huge effects. You can't actually locally suspend gravity without having huge effects. And also, God, if he does this, is sort of working against the mechanisms is set up, as it were. Whereas if you say gravity operated, but God provided this additional force to uplift Jesus and Peter as they walked across, I think that makes much better sense to a scientist, and also it makes very good theological sense that God is just uplifting them as they walked across. And then in the resurrection, that God is providing new forces, additional forces. So, but I think that is occasional, and I think the working in, with, and through nature is the usual way with which God operates. And I think we can learn through this because if this happens today, and I think it does, then these are miracles of timing, and God, in principle, can involve us as he involved Moses, but we need to be attuned to the mind of God much more than I certainly am, to actually be part of God's activity in the world. So I think that is the final, and dinner's very close, I know, so thank you very much. Right.